Certainly not how I expected our next meeting to play out, Gyostai, Syzygy admitted, with his face slightly flushed, as he looked at James and his accompanying guards. The fact that the dark-skinned Miat had his own troop of soldiers with him seemed to do little to ease his mind overall, although it also wasn't clear what exactly was troubling him so much. James ran his mechanical hand through his hair, and offered a tired smile to the feline. He hadn't even bothered with his breath filter today, opting to show his face right at the start. Well, although we've barely met, you've certainly been quite the presence during our stay here on Dunamur, James mused, before briefly breaking eye contact with the dealer of pleasure and comfort, as his eyes scanned over the teams of workers scurrying about all around them, as they carried around the necessary materials to build an impromptu stage set in front of a wide array of cameras. Ultimately, his eyes came to rest on the large carving prominently displayed on the compound surrounding a Veselon server, the large half of a tree trunk, engraved with the symbol that they had grown all too familiar with during their stay, the hand-embalming claw marks. Today it would serve as the backdrop to the little announcement the two of them would make to the planet. It seems only fitting that it would end this way. Overcome by a sudden streak of energy, James then joined his fingers together and stretched his arms far into the air, feeling the tensions in his arm and back loosening up as he let out a strange sound and rotated his shoulders. As he did so, the cool air of the not-quite-so-frigid south enveloped him and brought a nice, refreshing feeling to his skin. The fact that he was walking around the place in short sleeves had certainly gotten him some interesting looks from the surrounding felines, especially as he stood right next to Tshirt, who was currently wearing what had to be the most amount of clothes and fabric James had ever seen on a Miat, period. Although it admittedly might also have had something to do with the fact that no sleeve also meant nothing to cover his mechanical limb, which meant that the grey texture polymer standing in for his skin on his right side was on full display for everyone to see. Tshirt was wrapped in what had to be at least 3 layers of black, cold-resistant clothing, that gave him an even darker appearance than he already had, which just made his glass-green eyes cut out of his face all the more. Thick plumes of white steam escaped his mouth and nose with every breath he released. Then, Tshirt smacked his lips. "I'm afraid that was the Veselon's work, much more than it was mine," he said, averting his eyes from James and looking seemingly uselessly around the compound. "I barely had the time to react to your presence." "Quite," James concurred with a quick nod. Then they were quiet for a moment. "Are you sure they should be out here already?" Tshirt asked after a few seconds of silence. As he was looking around, his scanning eyes had apparently come to a halt on the people accompanying James, who were currently standing watch a few meters away from the two meeting diplomats, and some of whom still had quite obvious bandages covering their still relatively fresh wounds. Especially for Tuya, the injury was quite hard to miss, since the bright white patch was still covering the largest part of her neck, keeping it tightly wrapped. And then there was of course Shida, who had a quite similar one right on her face. "They're a tough bunch, you don't have to worry about them," he mused lazily, and inadvertently took a step closer to Tshirt. The man's ears slightly twitched as James walked up to him, and almost instinctively he took a step away, negating the primate's attempt at an approach. James lifted an eyebrow and looked at him incredulously, while Tshirt apparently only realised what he had done after the fact, and immediately moved to try and laugh it off. "Careful, Gyostai," the feline sniggered, his face still flushed, likely both from the cold surroundings and the awkwardness of the situation. "You don't sneak up on a Miad like that." The corner of James's mouth lifted into a mild smile, as he also lifted his left arm, presenting the 5 deep scars visible on his skin. "Trust me, I'm aware," he assured the man with a calm certainty. However, there was a certain uncomfortableness still very visible on Tshirt's face, as if there was a certain struggle for him in even being close to James at this time. At first, James had suspected that it had something to do with his mechanical arm, but while that certainly played a part, it didn't seem like Tshirt was all too fixated on the robotic appendage. And the longer the interaction had gone on, the more James had realised what was actually the matter. He took another look over at the stage that was being assembled for them in front of the cameras, where they would be giving their little addressing. It didn't give them all too much room as it seemed. Reservedly, James cleared his throat. "You know," he started, wondering for a moment if there was a tactful way to subtly approach the topic. However, in the short time he had given himself to think by speaking up first and thinking later, he couldn't think of anything, and so he felt that it was ultimately better to get straight out with it, especially since Tshirt was already starting to look back at him confusedly. "If you have to take your medicine while I'm around, that's fine. I know that it's probably a cultural thing or whatever, but you really don't have to hide it for my sake." Zishidi's green eyes flashed in a very clear recognition of what he was saying, and it seemed like his breath stopped short for just a moment. However, he quickly regained his composure, lifting his eyebrows in slight ridicule as he regarded James's face. "Medicine?" he asked, his voice going high enough to almost seem mocking. "What medicine?" However, James wasn't in the mood, and he just gave the man a serious stare. "I've been around a Meerton heat for the past week," he said dryly, and folded his arms loosely in front of his stomach. "By now I know the signs." Zishidi scoffed. "Heat?" he asked, playing up his acted confusion at the statement quite a bit. "You like flattering yourself, don't you? But I'm afraid you may be following the wrong trail. Not to me, I do get heat, you know." James sighed. "I'm not narcissistic enough to think it has anything to do with actual attraction," he said, while already turning on his heels to look back at his coterie, and completely ignoring the implications of that statement. The movement instantly got everyone's attention. With just 2 quick signs of his hand, he had indicated for Shida to come over to the two of them for a second. "But I am selfish enough that I don't want you to make yourself uncomfortable around me, especially when we're working together." "What's up?" Shida loudly asked, as she had gotten within conversational distance, cutting Zishidi off before he had a chance to reply to James's statement. "You got your pills with you?" James asked, without beating around the bush, causing Shida to confusedly tilt her head and lift a single ear. However, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small white package without further ado. James simply lifted his hand in a ready position, and Shida took that as a sign to toss said package directly into it. James caught her without much problem and immediately turned to offer it to Zishidi. The Mia seemed to be stunned into silence for a second. It seemed that he wasn't quite equipped to deal with the fact that his attempts at deflection and ridicule had been so utterly ignored. Briefly, it seemed like he was trying to gear up for another attempt. However, one look at James's face apparently proved to him that the primate was far from uncertain in his assertions of the situation, and that trying to sway him would likely be way more trouble than it was worth. So, after a long stare that lasted for multiple seconds, he sighed, and took the package out of James's hand. "How did you know?" he asked, beginning to fiddle with the package, which was slightly harder due to the thick gloves he wore against the cold. James just chortled. "I've got experience," he admitted, without going into detail. "These days I sometimes know before people do themselves." Then he threw a quick glance over at Shida, and for a moment a slight panic rose up within him. Oh, and Shida knew as well, he quickly added, a good bit less calm than he had been before, as he didn't want to seem like he was outing Zishidi without permission. "I guess it helped that you never changed your name. Was not hard to stumble across that while researching you." By then, Zishidi had managed to free a single pill from the package, placing it in the middle of his palm. "Change my name?" he asked confusedly, before popping the pill in one smooth motion. "Why would I do that?" James took a deep breath to reply to that. However, as he did so, he already decided that he wasn't going to get into it, so he let most of it out again in a sigh. "Never mind," he just mumbled. "It's a whole thing." Zishidi clearly smelled a story behind that, as his glass-green eyes flashed interestedly. However, it seemed like he also knew better than to dig into it at the time. "I see," he merely agreed to James's statement, and closed his eyes for a moment while waiting for the medicine to work, handing the package back to James, who in turn tossed it back to Shida. Since it was already out, his girlfriend apparently decided that she might as well also take one of the small white pills, before storing the tiny carton back in her pocket. Apart from that, she wasn't very talkative today. Soon after, they were called to get ready for the filming. James put his jacket back on and hid his mechanical hand under sleeve and glove again, while Zishidi shed a few layers for the time being so he wouldn't look quite so packed in the video. Though seeing what he wore underneath, James wondered for a moment. "Are you sure you want to wear work clothes for something like this?" he asked the feline, while taking in the sight of the dark, suit-like garb he was wearing. Mentally, he compared it to Quafrem's fancy golden armour that he tended to sport at every important meeting or event. However, Zishidi just casually brushed his black jacket down, trying to get rid of some wrinkles that had formed as he had worn it under his much thicker overcoat. "I'm working, am I not?" he replied, and flashed a single white fang out from under his dark lips. And admittedly, James didn't really have a good retort to that. At least this way, they would match. To James's surprise, they were then briefly pulled aside for a quick masking process. The makeup applied to their faces wasn't quite as excessive as he was used to from the media back on Earth. However, it did mean that the dark bags under his eyes weren't on full display while he was addressing the people of Dunaba and his territories. Also, he merely wondered for a second how much work it might have been to find a foundation matching his incredibly pale skin tone that barely any Miat even came close to. Maybe Quathwem had helped them out. Bright, hot lights were directed at them as they stepped in front of the cameras. At first, James felt slightly nervous. However, compared to previous speeches he had to make under similar circumstances, this one felt rather underwhelming. He wasn't basically held at gunpoint this time. Neither was he basically threatening to declare a sort of war on the entire galaxy. It was just a rather standard speech. Against his moral beliefs, but also supported by his better judgment, it had obviously been decided that the public would be mostly kept in the dark about the dealings that were actually going on between the two high-class Deathworlds. The speech merely declared the future cooperation between Earth and Dunima, Miet and humans. The fact that there were major political and economic dealings going on behind the scenes was conveniently left out. Of course, James had no idea what kind of deals were exactly being worked out between the planets, even as he spoke, but in this case, he also felt that ignorance may have been bliss. He didn't know how the people of Dunima may have reacted had they known that a single realized had basically decided for all of them to put their fate into humanity's metaphorical hands, but he had a sneaking suspicion that it may not have made them all too happy. This way, they would get to keep their peace of mind for just a little bit longer. Even more than that, in fact, as this alliance also brought the possibility of Dunima's supply problem being solved, in one way or another. In light of recent events, the two planets also officially announced to develop a closer military relationship to each other, something that had even surprised James when he heard it for the first time that morning. And with those promises hanging in the air, and more secrets kept than dealings disclosed, the recording ended almost as soon as it had begun. At least it felt that way. As soon as it was over, James immediately checked the time. Not that he had much purpose for that. An hour or two, or even a few, would barely make a difference at this point, so it hardly mattered how much time they spent here. Still, he felt compelled to have an eye on it at all times, since they were already cutting it mighty close with their future plans. He just hoped Uton was still as punctual as he was used to from the captain. Suddenly, as he hopped off the makeshift stage while still looking down at his phone with a scowl, James felt something tugging on his leg. Surprised, he turned his head to look down and immediately saw a familiar pair of bright amber eyes staring back up at him out of a round face. Putting his phone away, he swiftly leaned down and scooped the girl that had been responsible for his accidental reveal of his identity during the first visit to this compound into his arms. Looking back on it, she had provided him with the first hint at Avezalon's true nature back then, when the AI had managed to instantly and effortlessly unscramble his distorted voice, coming out of his breath filter in just one sentence. "Can I help you?" he now repeated said sentence, his face inadvertently lighting up as he looked at the child and lifted her to his eye level, despite the glum thoughts he was having. Obviously he didn't expect her to understand him, but hopefully his tone would get his amusement at the situation across all right. The girl looked back at him for a second, her not yet fully grown ears twitching as she listened to his voice. Then she seemed to shudder for a second, and then started to press herself against his chest while crossing her arms tightly. It was only then that James noticed that the girl wasn't appropriately dressed for this weather at all, only wearing a relatively thin shirt and pants. Instinctively he pulled her in closer, putting his free arm around her protectively while quickly glancing around to try and find where she may have come from so suddenly. He didn't find anything immediately. However, a dark silhouette moving in the corner of his vision then pulled his attention towards it, as someone was apparently approaching him. Before he had fully realized it, he felt something heavy and warm being draped around him and the child, and it took him a second to fully process that Tshirt had wrapped his thick overcoat around the child, hanging it over James's shoulders so it would hold in place, and hopefully keep the girl warm. "Zafia has been quite excited since she heard that you would come visit again," he mused, before James had a chance to say anything. Meanwhile, he felt the girl nuzzle up tighter against him, even now that there was an additional source of warmth provided to her. "Seems he just couldn't wait to say goodbye." James looked down at the girl nesting against his chest once more, slightly bewildered. The reaction seemed a little overzealous to him. After all, he had met the girl exactly once, and even then, their interaction had been rather brief. But then he remembered that he had also once been a child, and how different things had been for him back then. Small things could turn into quite big things if you were small yourself, and who could even guess how a child of a whole different species might perceive the world? One way or the other, children deserved it that the world was a safe and exciting place for them. And so, James just held the girl and allowed her to rest in his arms while she dealt with whatever big emotions were going through her tiny mind right now. "She tries her best, but Avezalon is no Moldor," Tshirt mused on, with a brief glance at his face. James noticed the feline looking over towards the server room. There, out of a slightly open door leading into the barren concrete walls of the building, were a lot of tiny faces looking out at the hustle and bustle going on outside of their home, although most of them were apparently repelled by the outside cold enough to be convinced to stay inside and just take in what was happening visually. And I am certainly no father. Hearing that, James looked back at Zishidi's dark face for a second, before his gaze sank down onto the overcoat that was still draped around him. He smirked. Maybe you should give yourself more credit, he murmured, while slightly bobbing the girl up and down. Then, a bit louder and addressing more the empty air than anyone in particular, he added, "Oh well, let's get you inside before you catch death out here." As he and Zishidi moved towards the door together, the curiously observing children quickly scampered away, as if they were scared of being busted for some sort of trouble they were making, although nobody had the intention of punishing them for anything. When they arrived, the children had already retreated deeper into the outer shell of their surrogate mother. Thinking about that gave James a bunch of mixed feelings that he wasn't quite sure he knew the names of, especially as he stared up the large blank walls and constantly remembered what was housed inside. "Nobody on the planet would dare mess with a Veselon," Zishidi suddenly assured him, after he had apparently noticed the look on James's face. "It is the safest place there is." For just a second, the image of an enormous strike of blinding light hitting the building nanoseconds before it went up in an enormous explosion of rubble and burning plasma flashed before James's inner eye, and he had to avert his gaze for a second as he banished it from his mind. However, the threat of a potential hostile annihilation wasn't actually what weighed on him as he looked around himself, seeing the wide open space of the coldly paved compound around the building. He saw the tall walls and the weapons installed behind and on top of them. He saw the soldiers patrolling. He saw the garages housing who knew what equipment for them to use. And from the inside he heard the constant, soft electrical hum of a Veselon's ever-active server. "The safest place isn't always the best place to be," he said, looking back down to the girl in his arms, who had her eyes closed while still softly shivering. Even now she was still cold. Zishidi smacked his lips. "I have promised the Veselon to take care of these kittens," he started. But James stopped him by raising his free hand out from under the coat. "I know," he said conciliatorily, not wishing to start a fight over this. "I just hope it won't be necessary to do it here for much longer." With humanity backing him up, maybe there was a chance that Zishidi wouldn't have to hide out here for much longer. James then let out a hoarse laugh. "Well, if my people are giving you any trouble, you have my number," he said, with a bit of a chuckle, and a tired smile at Zishidi. "Feel free to use it any time." Then he pulled the coat off of his shoulders, handing it back to Zishidi, before crouching down and setting the girl onto her feet inside of the building. "And you keep those bright eyes while I'm gone," he told her, and reached out to ruffle through her hair for a second, while she looked back at him with an almost wistful expression. "I'll keep it in mind," Zishidi said, thanking him with a nod, before his attention was apparently caught by something else, as his gaze wandered off to the side a bit. As James also turned his head, he was surprised to see that Shida suddenly stood right next to him, as if she had spontaneously materialized there. Obviously she had merely followed the two of them, quietly enough that James hadn't noticed her until then. However, he still had to hold back a slightly startled reaction to her suddenly appearing like that. He stood up again to see what she wanted. However, as soon as he had done so, Shida was suddenly crouching down, taking his place in front of Sapphire. James and Zishidi both looked on wordlessly, as Shida reached out, carefully using her thumb to gently rub away at the corner of Zapphire's right eye, removing some dirt that had seemingly accumulated there. Then she said something to her, something that James obviously did not understand. However, she sounded both calm and firm as she spoke, and a brief glance over at Zishidi's face revealed that he apparently found whatever she was telling the child there to be worthy of a slight raise of his eyebrows. After listening to what Shida had to say carefully, Sapphire thought for a moment, and then replied something in a spry, vivacious tone, to which Shida reacted by immediately shoving her flat hand right into the girl's face, pushing her back slightly. It wasn't aggressive or violent. She did it in the same way that she would push James's head aside whenever he said something that she found to be embarrassingly disagreeable. The way the girl giggled as her face was pushed back also indicated that she found no serious offence in what Shida was doing, and she merely tried to fruitlessly remove Shida's palm from her face while laughing away. Soon after, Shida was already standing up again, pulling her hand back, and leaving Sapphire to look up at her. With a swift movement of her hand and a single word, Shida seemingly dismissed the girl, And to James's surprise, Sapphire didn't hesitate, immediately turning on the spot and running down the long hall deeper into the building, her footsteps quickly becoming inaudible as she hurried away from the adults. James looked at his girlfriend quizzically. "What did you tell her?" he asked. After just his questioning gaze hadn't enticed her to answer after a few seconds. Shida let out a quick breath through her nose. "That she's a bit young to be taken along," she replied after a moment, sounding a lot less amused than James had expected given the situation. In fact, her tone had more of an air of nostalgia to it, and that she should better study in the meantime, so she's ready the next time we see her. James looked at her in admitted surprise, having imagined a number of different things she could have told the girl, although this had admittedly not been one of them. Shida then turned to Tshirt. "I trust that you can manage to arrange some materials for her?" she asked, with an unexpected seriousness to it, that quickly instilled a certainty into James that her words had been far more than an empty promise. However, her earnest tone seemed to glide right off Tshirt, who simply scoffed at her words. "This alone would have my head if I didn't give them the best education," he said, obviously implying that he didn't need Shida's prompting in order to take care of the children. Shida nodded. Then she turned to James. "We should probably get going," she said, and tapped at her wrist with her index finger to indicate pressing time, a gesture that she had most likely copied after spending time with the humans. "Right," James said, also nodding, and then he turned towards Tshirt while standing straight at attention. "Goodbye, Tshirt. Until we meet again," he said, reaching out his mechanical hand invitingly and smiling at the feline. Tshirt didn't even hesitate and immediately accepted his offered hand, gripping it firmly and giving it a quick shake before letting go again. "You told me that you want people to have the choice," he said, pulling his arm back and throwing his overcoat over his shoulders. "I am glad you are a man of your word, and I'm glad that you made the right one." James let out an exasperated breath. "Well, time will tell on that," he replied, feeling a heavy pit forming in his stomach as he took another look at the server building next to him. He certainly hoped that he had made the right choice here. But if he really wanted people to not judge him or others by their nature alone, it was the only choice he could have made. Tshirt clacked his lips once more. "Goodbye, James," he said, before turning his gaze suddenly. "And goodbye, Shida. Don't forget your home while you're out there." Shida seemed to suddenly freeze up at his words, and her arms almost instinctively crossed in front of her body. "I won't," she mumbled. "Goodbye." Not long after, James was using their ship's communication system to make a last call while they were on their final departure from the planet Dunima, at least for the time being. "Ambassador, what can I help you with?" Lord Javar's voice came out of the speakers, much to James's surprise. "Lord Javar?" he replied, slightly suspicious, but in an upbeat tone. "I'm surprised that Quafem is not talking to me personally. No offense to you, of course, but after all we've been through, I would have expected that he'd at least say his farewells to me personally." Lord Javar cleared his throat and made a contemplative sound. "Forgive him. The boss is quite busy with getting his affairs in order. I hope that is understandable. After all, a lot has happened," he said reluctantly. And indeed, James could imagine that there was quite a bit to do for the Quafem Thera Comatapano. After all, they would have to prepare for something they hadn't had in ages now. Competition. And of course, there would also be political circumstances to handle. They were still the major force of the planet, after all. And besides, Lord Javar suddenly added, pulling James back out of his thoughts, "I believe the time for farewells has not come yet. I don't think the last time you two will have spoken is anywhere close to us." James rolled his eyes. He could only hope that the assistant was wrong. "Right," he mumbled, but ultimately decided to drop the topic. Then he got a bit more serious as he brought the next one up. "Anyway, I better not hear anything about those soldiers being mistreated." He let that statement sit for a second, as he thought back to the familiar faces that had been on the morning broadcast of the currently outstanding bounties. Apparently the soldiers that had tried to detain them back on Descantiot had ran off and hidden somewhere once they had caught wind that their higher-ups had been severely reprimanded for the orders they had given them, and the diplomatic incident they had ultimately caused. "I don't care what they did to me or what they've caused for you, they deserve a fair trial and adequate punishment," James stressed once again. "And your people will have ample opportunity to make sure of that," Lord Javar assured him almost immediately, sounding rather professionally delighted about the change of topic. "After all, it has been decided that their apprehension will be handled as a cooperative effort between Earth and Dunima, should it not have been achieved by the time the human warship arrives in our system." James paused. A cooperative effort? And a warship in the system? This early? Things sure were moving fast with these militaristic relations. Did they tell you what ship they would be sending? He asked out of interest. Loijevar paused and thought for a second. I believe my translators told me it was called the UHSDF Crystal Knight, he replied, sounding rather unsure of that name. However, he had gotten it right, and the name caused James's breath to get stuck in his throat for a second. The Crystal Knight. Yet another atrocity-class ship, even if not quite of the same caliber as the Sun was. Still, it seemed Earth was not playing around. He felt like he probably shouldn't particularly express this to the assistant, though. Ah yes, I am familiar, he merely replied after a second. That should be more than enough to handle any upcoming trouble. How reassuring, Loijevar said tonelessly, and James could only agree to the clear sarcasm his non-tone brought with it. Have fun dealing with that, James added in his mind, while he also tried to wreck his brain in order to remember which admiral was in charge of the Knight right now. But the memory escaped him. He could always look it up later. Well, anyway, we will likely be out of comm range soon, he quickly mumbled as he realised he was getting lost in thought, shaking his head to regain his focus. It's probably better if we end it here, before we get cut off. Farewell, Loijevar. Until we meet again, Ambassador, the feline replied. Then the connection was cut, and final preparations for their departure could begin. Next stop, Nosimano Station, where a much more personal matter was waiting for them. And while James and Shida prepared for their very personal meeting with a man of their past, someone else was looking into the future that he felt just as personally connected to. This is almost too perfect, isn't it? Alexander Page asked one of his men, while he sat in the light of the burning star Satak, enjoying yet another one of the bright, hot days of Dunama. His eyes were fixed on a report that was displayed on the screen of his phone that lay on a small table in front of him, right next to a cool glass of water and ice. Said report had just been sent to him after his men had apparently spent the entire previous night, plus the first half of this day, decoding and deciphering an exchange of encrypted messages that had taken place between Dunama and Earth the previous day. And the things they had found out, well, they were almost too good to be true. Are we sure this is genuine? We are, his companion, that had transmitted the message to him, confirmed with a nod of his head. More than certain, a second voice concurred with him, and Alexander lifted his eyes to look at his source. Keeping in the shade a slight distance away from the conversation, sat a disgruntled-looking Miat. His posture was hunched and subdued, as if he tried to avoid pulling any attention onto himself, and most of his face was hidden in a hood that he had pulled deeply over his face. Although Alexander could still see certain features stick out, even from under it, like a bright white bandage that was plastered over part of his cheekbone, where he had apparently fairly recently sustained a rather harsh injury. Command was already shitting themselves when they only had a hunch. Now it's pretty much confirmed, the gruff-sounding feline continued, without ever making eye contact with Alexander. Instead, he seemed to constantly look around, and with the announcement that they made this morning, I've no doubt that Earth knows. Not to mention, Alexander's companion then chimed in once again, even if there was a possibility of the transmission being fake, I don't think the UHSDF would ever use something like this, even as a decoy. They usually don't joke around with AI. Alexander nodded to himself as he listened to their statements. Absent-mindedly, his hand wandered towards the pendant around his neck, the cross framed by a pentagram, closing around it gently. For a moment, he wondered if he would even dare to hope here. Sure, Quartframe had turned out to be a rather disappointing venture, ultimately, but could his so-far wasted time instead truly be rewarded by something so much better? Was it possible that the world was out to punish James so much more than it wanted to thwart him? Or maybe, could this possibly be the enigmatic will that the Leader Supreme was so often on about? Something that tried to set the universe onto the right path by presenting the right people with the right opportunities. Had a higher power not yet fully abandoned them? Alexander scoffed. It was still too early to hope for that. However, his fist now closed tightly around his pendant. If that is so, we have no time to waste, he announced loudly, and got to his feet, never taking his hand off of his symbol. If our foes are fraternizing with havoc, if they chose to reveal their true nature to themselves while trying to conceal it from the world, then there can't be a better time to act than right now. He quickly walked past the two men who stared at him surprisingly for a second, before hurrying to move as well, Gather everyone. I want them ready by the hour, Alexander commanded. And he already made the necessary arrangements on his phone, ensuring that their ship would be ready by then as well. According to this report, this world is already tainted, so we must make haste and leave this wretched place, before the same thing happens to our home as well. The time to act is now. It had been a long time since he had to take such an official tone when talking to his men. However, it sure was effective. His companion didn't even hesitate before sprinting ahead, in order to prepare everyone for their departure. And thus, Alexander was left alone with the feline. "Wretched place, huh?" the man commented, venom spewing from his voice. Alexander turned towards him, directing his blue eyes right onto the dark ones of the Miat. "If you want, you can come along. A tainted home doesn't mean we won't help those who helped us," he told him in no uncertain terms. "The same is, of course, true for your colleagues as well. We can always use more aid." The now former Miat soldier smacked his lips and growled. "Well, do I have a choice?" But Alexander smiled back at him. "Of course you have a choice. We all have a choice at all times," he said, and finally his hand let go of his talisman, that had already left dark red streaks within his palm from the way that he had been clutching it. Now the pendant was free to dangle in front of his chest and glint in the bright light of Satak. However, just as you always have a choice, you must always live with its consequences as well. Thus is our fate as the unsaved.